All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another live stream here this evening. Glad that you could be with us. If you're watching this on YouTube, just be aware that there is a Zoom meeting every single week, 4 times a week. On Sunday morning at 9:30, we have two different lessons. That's Eastern time. Sunday evening at 5 p.m. we have another lesson, and then Wednesday evening at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. The Zoom channel is open, so feel free to enter in the user ID there, or the Zoom ID, and come and join us in this way. Tonight we're going to be talking about atonement a little bit more. We have looked at everything so far from the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 to Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, and then of course to Noah in Genesis chapter 9. This evening we're going to be looking at the Passover event in the book of Exodus, and so if you'd like to go ahead and go in your Bible to Exodus chapter 6. Now, the Exodus account of the Passover here is probably one of the most important passages in the Old Testament in regards to our study of the sacrifice of Christ. Does anyone know why the Passover would be one of the most important passages in the Old Testament in that regard? So, what did you say?
Mama said the death of Christ.
That's exactly right. Let me see. Let's let Johnny back in here. Yeah. So there we go. So one of the reasons why the Passover is so important for us to study. Hey, good evening, Thomas. Good to see you. Is because of Jesus being our Passover. In the book of 1 Corinthians, specifically, in chapter 5 and verse 7, we read, "Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, has also been sacrificed." And so if we're going to have a good understanding of the sacrifice of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, it is so important that we go to the Passover account in the book of Exodus and see what the scripture says there about the Passover lamb, and what will be true about the Passover lamb will be true about Jesus' sacrifice as well. And one of the reasons why we know this is because not only did Paul call Jesus the Passover sacrifice there in 1 Corinthians 5, but in the New Testament, the gospel writers in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John make it a point to connect Jesus to the Passover lamb. And one of the main indications of that, of course, is the fact that Jesus was bound and determined to go to Jerusalem the week of the Passover for the specific purpose, I think, of fulfilling the Passover types and shadows. That's what he wanted to do, is he wanted to be the Passover lamb. And so that's why he picked Passover. Jesus did not pick the Day of Atonement to die on. Jesus did not pick the Feast of Tabernacles, the Day of Pentecost. He specifically chose the Passover. And that doesn't mean that those other things don't relate to Jesus, but we see how the Passover takes on a sort of a prime meaning, a more elevated meaning than these other passages. Though they do contribute to our understanding of Jesus' death on the cross and how all that works, so to speak. But the Passover is the main ritual or the feast day that's alluded to in the New Testament in connection with the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. But one of the main reasons for that is because the New Testament is dependent upon this one major theme, and that is the new Exodus. This idea that God would reconcile through Christ everything in heaven, on earth, under the earth, as one writer says in Ephesians chapter 1, and also as Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And that whole theme of reconciling and bringing the people out of the bondage to sin is related to this new Exodus theme that's found throughout the New Testament. And we've talked about that theme quite a bit. And so that's one of the main reasons why Jesus chose Passover, that to be the day that he would die on because of its connection to this Exodus theme that's found throughout Isaiah and throughout the New Testament, and of course, as mentioned before, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb in Exodus chapter 12 and 13 is related to Jesus' death on the cross. And so, first, let's go to Exodus chapter 6, and I'm going to read verse 2 through 8, really. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them, to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourn. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. In the New Testament, in Romans especially, the Apostle Paul focuses on this idea of bondage and groaning from Exodus chapter 6 and verse 5 in relation to humanity's bondage and groaning under that bondage to sin or to Satan, as some have suggested in a study of the book of Romans. And so this groaning under bondage in Exodus 6 verse 5 is a theme that Paul taps into, especially in Romans chapter 8, but in Romans chapter 6 as well. Regardless, he goes on to say in verse 6, Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. That's one of the things that Jesus promised to do as well, in his ministry. And I will deliver you from their bondage. I'll also, here's the big verse I wanted to look at. I'll also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. So God promises that he's going to buy them back. He's going to purchase them out from underneath slavery from the Egyptians. He's going to rescue them from that through his outstretched arm and with great judgments, as you see there in Exodus 6 and verse 6. And then, of course, he goes on to say, Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I'll bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'll give it to you for possession. I am the Lord. And so Exodus 6, again, is one passage that is referred to over and over again in the New Testament. A lot of the imagery within this text is used to talk about the work of Jesus on the cross. The Egyptians would be a sort of equivalent there to Satan or to sin, and the work of Jesus on the cross then would be redeeming them from those enemies with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. One of the things that Jesus said when facing the cross, of course, was, the prince of this world is judged. And he said that in relation to his work on the cross. And so Exodus chapter 6 sets up this, this wonderful theme of Exodus that's going to be alluded to throughout the Bible, but especially in the New Testament in relation to the work of Jesus. This idea of groaning under bondage and God redeeming us, buying us back out of bondage, out from the burdens of the Egyptians, is a theme I said again, is just alluded to throughout the New Testament. So that being said, let's go to the final plague. Exodus chapter 12 is where we're going to go directly. In Exodus 11, the plague is introduced there in verses 1 through 10, but we're going to go ahead and go to Exodus 12 because I assumed that most people here are already familiar with the 10 plagues, especially the death of the firstborn in Exodus chapter 11. And so in Exodus 12, we have a discussion here of the Passover lamb. Notice the reordering of the calendar here in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2. The scripture says, Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. The thing that ordered the rest of Israel's year was the Passover event. The thing that got them out of Egyptian bondage. The sacrifice of the Passover lamb, the destroyer coming to take the lives of the firstborn who did not have that lamb offered up within their house. This is the event that would kick off Israel's year, and so this is the first month of the year to them. Then he tells them this in verse 3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month they are each to take a lamb for themselves according to their fathers' households, a lamb for each household. Now, they take the lamb on the 10th day of the month. Skip down to verse 6 for just a moment, and notice he says, "You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month." So they would get the lamb on the 10th, and they would keep it and offer it on the 14th day, which means there was a 4-day period from the time that they got the lamb to the time that they offered it up. Now, in our study of sacrifice so far in the Bible, the last thing that we looked at in the book of Genesis, if you recall, basically followed the same pattern. Does anybody remember what we studied last week? Remember last week we talked about the sacrifice of what, or of who?
The sacrifice of Christ.
Well, that is what we've been focused on, sort of in an overarching sense. But last week, remember, it was Abraham offering up Isaac.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And if you recall, all the way back in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, that God told Isaac in Genesis 22 and verse 2 to take his son, his only son, whom he loved, and go into the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I'll tell you. And then do you remember what happened? What happened after that? In verse 3, they rise up early in the morning, they get all their things together, they split the wood in verse 3, and then on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And so he was told on day 1, you add 3 days to that, how long it took him to travel, that's 4 days between hearing the command to go and to offer Isaac and arriving at the mountain in Moriah to actually offer up Isaac. It took 4 days. And that is why in Exodus chapter 12, Moses was told by God to wait 4 days. Keep the lamb until the 14th day on the same month, and then you're to slay the lamb. The offering up of Isaac, that is Abraham's only son, as he was told, and we had questions about that last week, lines up with what we have in Exodus 12, and this offering up of the lamb in light of the possibility that the firstborn would die. So Exodus 12 borrows from the binding of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, and this is one of the major things that is that's done here is a lamb is offered up in place of the firstborn after a 4-day waiting period, right? So that's just kind of interesting. And so let's go back to Exodus 12 and look at verse 3 again. So he says, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each to take a lamb for themselves according to their fathers' households, a lamb for each household." Notice that it's a lamb for each household. That's a lamb for each, subsection of these tribes. And this is not the priesthood wasn't even initiated yet, right? So this is not something that the priests, did. This is something that that the heads of the household participated in. This isn't something done, originally it wasn't something done in a temple. It was something done locally in the people's house. Now, of course, this Passover celebration did become a pilgrimage feast in Leviticus 23 and forward, where the people would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, to be there in the presence of the temple. But here in Exodus 12, it was to be done in their individual houses, and that's how we can sort of see, that it related in the New Testament, where the people there would take the emblems of the Passover in remembrance of their Passover, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and would celebrate those emblems on a regular basis. Now in Exodus 12, he says this in verse 4, "If the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat, and you're to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." The word or the expression "a year old" there in verse 5, in my version, maybe a mistranslation there. Some versions indicate it's not really necessarily exactly a year old. It could just be under a year old. Just the idea is a young lamb.
Mine says a male.
Oh, what does yours say, Zelda?
A year-old male.
Okay, so yours says a year-old male goat as well. Now the word lamb also, just as a side note, doesn't exclusively apply to sheep or to sheep. If you look at the end of the passage, he says you may take it from the sheep or from the goats, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because we typically think of goats as, like the bad guys, right? Because Matthew 25, he separates the sheep from the goats. But it's not inherently wrong to be, to be a goat in Exodus 12 and verse 5. There's nothing wrong with picking from the lamb or from the goats. So we typically associate goats with, all sorts of evil, but that's not necessarily the case. We're taking the parable or the picture of a shepherd separating a sheep from the goats a little bit too far in, there in Matthew chapter 25. All right, so on the 14th day of the first month, here in Exodus 12 and verse 6, they are to offer up this lamb. They're to kill this lamb at twilight. Now, one quick note about this. Let's see. On the 14th day of the month, there's some important things that happen on the 14th day of the month in Israel's history. For example, let's see. Oh no, I thought I had the note there. I must have not put it down. So some important things that happened on the 14th day of the month. One of those is Joshua decided to take the people into the land. They crossed over the Jordan River on the 14th day of the month. So that's that's an interesting side note there. I believe, if I remember correctly, I thought I wrote all this down, but I guess I put it somewhere else. But anyways, the 14th. Hang on, let me look at my notes here. Oh yeah, there we go. So Joshua chose the 10th of the first month. My bad. No wonder I couldn't find the note. I was on the wrong passage. Joshua chose the 10th of the first month to cross over the Jordan in later on in this story. Also, the Day of Atonement also falls on the 10th of the 7th month. And it's also the day that is, that ushers in the year of Jubilee as well, is the 10th of the month. And so the 10th apparently had some sort of special interest to Israel, and that's why it's held again from the 10th until the 14th. So, anyways, back to verse 6. They would keep it to the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel would kill it at twilight. Twilight is typically sometime between 3 and 5 p.m., which makes sense when we think about the sacrifice of Jesus, his death on the cross, and him crying out, "It is finished." Again, a term possibly connected to the Passover sacrifice. So there's a lot that goes on in the Passover story that relates to the events of the last week of Jesus. Now let's go back to Exodus chapter 12 and take a look at verse 7. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 7. He says, "Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled or at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left until morning you shall burn with fire." So Exodus chapter 12 and verse 7 through 10 just goes into some more specifics about what would go on in this Passover sacrifice. They were to take the blood and they had it inside this basin, and they would take it out. And use this branch to spread it there on the doorposts. And as we're going to notice a little bit later in the chapter, the spreading of the blood on the doorposts wasn't for God to see, but was really for them to see. We'll notice that here in a little bit, but It was a sign. It was a sign for them to see, as we're going to see. God didn't need that. He knew. He knew who made the offer. Who made the sacrifice and who didn't. Who ate the lamb and who didn't. So that wasn't something that he needed, but it was mainly for them. And that's one thing that you see a lot with rituals and things like that in the Old Testament. Is a lot of the rituals aren't for God, as if God needs these sorts of things. But they're for us. They're for the people who participate in them, because sometimes we're so stubborn and in so need of a sign that we need some outward expression of that to be able to see it. Here's one for you. God doesn't need baptism. There's nothing magical about baptism, but we as human beings, we need something. We need a sign. We need to see something. It's like the Jews there in Matthew 12. Show us a sign. And so God has given us some of these outward expressions of spiritual matters to have something to hang on to put our finger on, to see. And that's what the sacrifices were in the Old Testament in many cases. Many of those sacrifices of thanksgiving and offering weren't even, sin offerings at all. They had no transactional value in that sense. But they were ways that they could show and demonstrate their thankfulness to God. A way to know if they were in or not. And that's really what the big question on a lot of people's mind is am I in or am I not in? And outward expressions of those spiritual matters are things that God has put into place for us to be able to see. And that's what the blood is on the doorpost. It's for them to be able to see and say, okay, we've done it. We did it right. So now we can have confidence. It wasn't enough just to eat the lamb and go to sleep that night. They had to know that they had done it correctly. And so that's why a lot of these rituals and things like that are given. The spreading of the blood on the doorpost, though, does serve one sort of religious value, and it foreshadows the time, I suppose, whenever Moses and Aaron would cleanse the tabernacle with the blood of the lamb as well. And so some people have seen this Passover event where they would take the blood and put it on the doorposts as a way for them to say, okay, out there is Egypt, out there is the bad. That's the land of the uncleanliness. But in here is sacred, in here has been cleansed and purified by the blood of the lamb. And a lot of that imagery is actually used, of course, in the book of Hebrews to talk about Jesus' work as high priest in Hebrews chapter 9. But we'll get into that, when we get to Hebrews. We're in Exodus right now, so we're going to stay over here. But just kind of letting you know where we're going. Let's see. Okay, let's look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 11 here. He says, "Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." Let me give you this parallel here. Maybe this will help explain a passage for you. They're to eat with their loins girded. They got to be ready to go. They're eating standing up, right? They got to be ready to head out, okay? Their staff is in their hand. They're supposed to eat this in haste. The Hebrew word that is translated in haste here, which is a word that I'm not going to try to pronounce, means it expresses a sense of haste informed by anxiety. And it is a noun that is only used in connection with the Exodus. This noun is only used in connection with the Exodus. They're eating it there in anticipation of having to leave, in anticipation of having to flee Egypt. All right? When you look in the New Testament at some of these, some of these themes, like for example the girded loins there. There's passages that talk about being prepared in that way. For example, one of those is in 1 Peter chapter 1. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13, he says, "Gird the loins of your mind for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So there's this idea in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13 of, girding up their loins like they did on the Passover, being ready to leave, being ready to go. You got to get ready to, get out of Dodge. Why? Because the destroyer is coming, and so they're taking the Passover, anticipating God coming to judge Egypt. Now, isn't that similar to a passage that we're all familiar with in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." This isn't a passage about the Lord's Supper, ceasing to be important at some, point in time. This passage is about the manner in which they were to take the supper, right? Looking unto and hastening the day of the Lord, as Peter says it in 2 Peter chapter 3. This is taken in anticipation that the destroyer is going to come and he's going to pass over, he's going to pass over the remnant and destroy those who had rejected Christ. That comes from Exodus chapter 12 and verse 11, where they were to eat the Passover in haste. That's haste informed by anxiety, looking forward to, waiting, hastening the day of the Lord. And so that's what's happening in Exodus 12, and that's where that language comes from in passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 11. One more passage here, then we'll break for questions temporarily. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12, we read, "I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast." You hear the kitty cat? "And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." See, I was talking about Egypt there, and then one of the Egyptian gods got upset and came and meowed at the door. That always happens. So he says that he's going to go through the land of Egypt. He's going to strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. "And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." This is sort of a side note, but it's one that I think is interesting, and we should look into it more. All of the signs, all the plagues in the book of Exodus were about the Egyptian gods versus the God of Israel. The Nile, the frogs, the firstborn, being from, excuse me, who would have been considered the son of God. All these plagues are a direct attack on the Egyptian gods. This is one of the reasons why God was able to say in Exodus chapter 20, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Those Egyptian gods that they knew about, that apparently endorsed them being in captivity for 400 years, right? They were not to hold any of those gods before the God of heaven. He was the only one that they were to serve. And one of the reasons why he could say this is because he had executed judgment against all the gods of Egypt through these 10 plagues and the signs that Moses had shown earlier. All right. Okay, let's see. Let's go down a little bit in this passage to Exodus chapter 12. Let's see. I want to skip some of this here. And verse 21. We'll skip the Feast of the Unleavened Bread for now. Exodus 12:21. And does anybody have any questions there? Let's see. Thomas has a question. Can you tell me the chapter and verse you referenced about the word haste? So the word haste is Exodus 12, verse 11. And some of the passages that I was just thinking about because of that were passages like 1 Peter 1 and 13. They talked about girding up the loins of their mind. There's other passages, though. One of the main ones that I didn't bring up is Romans chapter 8 and verse 23. That passage, "waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body." That expression there, "waiting eagerly," if I remember, I guess the word eagerly sort of shows it. Is waiting in extreme anticipation, expecting that it's going to happen soon. That sort of waiting eagerly. And so those are just a couple of passages that I would relate to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 11. Okay, back to Exodus 12.
I have a question.
Oh, hey, Miss Carol.
Hey, how are you?
Doing
I'm sorry,
great.
this is far-reaching.
Go for it.
Let me just get this in. When at the cross, when Jesus said it's finished, but redemption still wasn't finished, what do you think that means?
Do you mean the day of redemption? That's talked about in Ephesians 4 and Romans 8? The redemption of...
Didn't on the cross Jesus say it was finished?
Yes, he did.
But we know that redemption wasn't completely finished, correct?
Right. There was a sense in which redemption was to come, but when he says it is finished, um, he's not there talking about the law or redemption necessarily. He's talking about there were all these prophecies that were being fulfilled, and if you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together, he mentions all these things that have been done, and so I think what he's saying there is that he has drank the cup of suffering that he came to drink, from Matthew chapter 26. He's drank the cup of suffering, and he is basically saying now, okay, all these prophecies have been fulfilled. Now it's time to let go, and so I think that's more of what he's saying when he says it is finished, because
Okay.
Justification. If we think about the word justification, for example, in the book of Romans chapter 4 and verse 25, the scripture says this: he was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised up because of our justification. When we talk about the sacrifice of Jesus, or as some people say, the atonement, one of the things that a lot of people do not take into account is the role not only that Jesus' death had, but also his resurrection, his ascension, and his ministry in heaven in Hebrews chapter 9, and then of course his second appearing. And so one of the reasons why people get so caught up in the world of atonement theory is because they do not take into account the role of the resurrection and the ascension that they had in the offering up of Jesus. In fact, Jesus' offering wasn't considered completed until he sat down at the Father's right hand. Hebrews chapter 10 goes a bit into that, but again, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. And so Jesus' expression, it is finished, I think more has to do with the work that he came to do on the cross specifically, and not in regards to the law or to, stuff like what we usually attribute to that passage. Some have suggested even that the expression "it is finished" is connected to some of the language that the priests would use on the day of Passover in sacrificing the lamb, because Jesus would have died at about the same time that all these families all over were killing the lambs for their Passover meal. So.
Right. Okay. That's good. I can see that. Yeah, that sacrifice was finished, just like in Egypt. The blood was on the doorpost, but they still had to get out and go to the promised land. Okay.
That's right. And one of the things that a lot of people, a lot of people love this passage that talk about this stuff is Joshua 5:9. It's not until they enter into the land of Egypt that he says, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Joshua 5:9. It wasn't until they went into the promised land that they were able to, that God said that. So.
Okay, thank you. That's good.
All right, let's look at Exodus chapter 12. Thank you for your question, of course, and look at verse. Let's see, we're kind of pretty familiar with 21 and 22 already. Let's look at verse 22 though, because there is one passage in there one part of that passage I got to point out. He says, "You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood, as he says there, that is in the basin to the lintel and to the doorposts, and none of you shall go outside the door of his house until the morning." That kind of goes back to what I was mentioning a second ago, how a lot of rabbis would look at the blood being applied to the doorposts as sort of cleansing the house. And so they were in their own little mini holy place within their house, whereas outside was Egypt, where it was unclean, and things like that. So there's some rabbinic traditions that get into that whole idea. Let's look at Exodus 12, and I want to look at, let's see. There was a passage that I wanted to see here, but I maybe don't have it in front of me. It'll pop up as we go down to the text. I just kind of want to skip some of this because we're not running out of time. That's not that big of a deal, but we are getting close to the end of this discussion. Let's see. Let's go to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 43 now. Let's look at verse 43. Okay. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat it, but every man's slave purchased with money. After you circumcise him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You're not to bring forth any of the flesh outside the house, nor are you to break any bone of it." All right, so that part there about verse 46, not breaking any bone of it, that does correlate with what happened with Jesus on the cross. Not a bone of his was broken. Okay? So I just wanted to point that out to you there in verse 46. Let's go to chapter 13. Let's get a couple more things here. One of the traditions that came from the Passover event was the sanctification of every firstborn, as you see there in Exodus 13 and verse 2. Concerning that, he says in verse, concerning that he says there in verse 11, "Now when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers and gives to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. If you do not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of a man among your sons you shall redeem." The price of redemption, by the way, just as a side note, was 5 shekels of silver from Numbers chapter 18 and verse 16. But the point is that this idea of redeeming the firstborn son in Exodus 13 and 13 is a tradition that came from the event of the Passover. Now, one of the major cool things about that is that when you get to the New Testament, what is Jesus called in several passages? For example, in Colossians chapter 1 and in Revelation chapter 1, Jesus is called the firstborn, the firstborn of the dead. He's called the firstborn as well in Romans chapter 8. And all those references to Jesus being the firstborn goes back to the Passover event and takes us back even further, of course, to the offering up of Isaac, where a lamb was offered up in Isaac's place. And then in the Passover event, we have a lamb being sacrificed in the place of the firstborn as well. And so this is going to set the stage for an understanding of Jesus' sacrifice for us in the New Testament. Does anybody have anything to add or take away? Any comments, questions, anything like that?
Daniel,
Yes, sir.
I also look at that first look that the blood, the sprinkling with the children of Israel. Well, when it was in Egypt, and the blood was supposed to be on the doorposts and so forth, and that blood, I would look at it being a covenant. That there was a covenant being made with God. It sort of like bring my mind back to, I think it was Exodus 24. It was when they made a covenant with God that they was going to do whatever Moses had said. And Moses took half the blood and he sprinkled the altar with it. The other half he sprinkled the people. It was making a covenant that was something sealed, like that they was making a covenant with God.
Right. That is. Let's see. That is one of the things that he mentions in Exodus chapter 12. I think is what it was, where after this, they would be brought into the land, and God would make a covenant with them. And so that is part of it, and that is one of the things that Jesus points out. In Matthew chapter 26, this is the blood of the new covenant, shed for many for the remission of sins. And so I do believe that it does signify the creation of a new covenant, but at least it goes into that. The passage I was thinking about a while ago was Exodus 12:13. Which again says, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, and I'll see the blood. When I see the blood, I'll pass over you." The sign of the blood was for them, so that they would see that and they would know that they were secure and safe, and the firstborn was safe as well. So that's one thing I wanted to go back and hit real quick.
That's good.
Let's see. All right. if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and stop the stream, and we can meet again another day. Whenever we talk about Jesus' sacrifice, of course, we're going to look at passages like Matthew 20 that talks about Jesus paying a ransom, and then the words like redemption and things related to that as well. One interesting thing though is the word atonement is one of the only words that we have that doesn't, I'm going to butcher how I say this, but basically it's one of the only words that we have that's, that doesn't come from really the Greek or the Hebrew. It's kind of a religious technical word that sort of we kind of came up with. So we'll talk about that when we get to the sacrifice of Jesus and start looking at different atonement theories. But that is one of the things that scholars have pointed out, is that the etymology of the word atonement does not have a Greek or Hebrew origin. We'll get to that, like I said, when we get to it. But I'll have to get together my resources for that. But okay, let's go ahead and stop the recording there, and we'll get back